The origins of Cynefin lie in knowledge management. In fact, the first major paper, which won an award or two of Cynefin in its current form, was Complex Acts of Knowing, which was specifically about knowledge management and communities. Yeah? As part of that work, I devised a series of principles of acts of knowing, of how we know things. And really those have persisted with some modifications ever since. So what I thought I'd do is just run through those because they act as a generic reminder. The first is that knowledge can only ever be volunteered, it can't be conscripted. You can't make people surrender their knowledge. Yeah, you can make them surrender information because they know they've got it, but knowledge is hidden. Yeah? And the example I always gave on this and still give was when I was in IBM, they wanted to share my knowledge of narrative work. And it wasn't kind of like that I didn't want to share it. I shared it with a core group of people. But I wasn't prepared to codify and put it on a knowledge management system for anybody to pick up. Partly because it would have taken me 3 decades to write it up properly, and secondly, you couldn't trust people. If you put something on a knowledge system and they used it and it worked, they claimed the credit. If it didn't work, they blamed you. So my issue wasn't a refusal to share knowledge, it was an unwillingness to be abused, which is a more common motivation. So either way, I got told I had to do it. Yeah, it got put into my bonus scheme, I needed to earn my bonus. I had a teenage daughter at the time, you need bonuses. And so I decided I would share knowledge in an unusable form, and I wrote a long paper which was mostly consisted of semicolons and multi-syllable words as a theoretical debate between Deleuze and Habermas, which I wrote after several glasses of whiskey. Nobody could say I hadn't shared my knowledge, but nobody can make any sense of it. Yeah? And basically it's very easy for people to hold things back if they don't want to do it. And this is an affordance issue. You need to create an ecosystem in which people are able to share what they know, but also it's an ecosystem in which they know that they can share with some degree of security. And part of that is working within smaller groups and not trying to share everything with everybody. Yeah, provided you're shared with some people, it doesn't matter because the organisation as a whole should be well enough networked to connect. This concept of codification is dangerous. Right, the second principle is we only know what we know when we need to know it. Human knowledge is deeply contextual, it's triggered by circumstance. So at some stage in your life you'll have said, I'll sleep on it. Yeah, that means you're engaged in a highly complex cognitive task, whereas if your computer is sleeping on something, you need to switch it on and off at the mains, so it needs to be hard rebooted. Yeah? So basically, knowledge is contextually stimulated. Yeah? Remember, people don't see the gorilla. Yeah, in the radiography case. The reason is they're only scanning a small amount of what they know at any one time. The way that ritual works is it triggers memories. Yeah, it triggers processes, it triggers practice. So realizing that you can't write down what you know in advance of need is key. Recognizing that context will trigger memories is key. And therefore realize you need a more distributed type of function. The ability to deploy and talk with people is also vital to knowledge management. Yeah? You can't expect for people to codify when they're asked a question, and that will lead into the work, we'll also describe the work we do on knowledge mapping, because to ask people what they know is to ask a stupid question in a stupid context. Yeah? We know things when we need to know them. The third one, this is an adaptation of Polanyi's famous statement, which I've extended, says we always know more than we can say, that's Polanyi, and for me we can always say more than we can write down. The process of taking something from your head to your mouth to your hands, from something you know but can't articulate to articulation to writing to codification, is a process of loss of content but principally of context. So if you write something down, there's so many assumptions made in the process. Now, my favourite way of illustrating this is to go back to when I first went to New York. I just started to work for IBM. I'd never been to New York in my life. And the basic principle of any good solid Welshman is find new city, find rugby ground, find opera house. So there aren't many cities where we can do both. New York doesn't currently have a rugby ground, although it is starting to build one. We have hopes of them entering the league shortly. But it did have an opera house which is mildly competent. It's not known for doing revolutionary things, but the Met is a good opera house. So I booked tickets for it. I was amazed at the price of these things because they were actually quite cheap compared with what I paid at the Royal Opera House in London. And if I'd been in the same seats in the Royal Opera House, I'd need to wear a dinner jacket. I couldn't go casually. So I took a dinner jacket over with me, and I was staying in Tarrytown. This is way north of New York, yeah? IBM land. There's so many IBM offices there, it's incredible. In the Tarrytown Hilton, which was a part of my life for years. Yeah? And so I get the train in on the Hudson Valley line into New York. Yeah? I get into Grand Central Station, I walk down Park Lane, I do a day's work in IBM, being laughed at because I'm wearing a dinner jacket. I'm not going to change, right? And then end of the day, go back, get the subway up, go to the Lincoln Center. Wonderful performance of Trovatore, yeah, but I was being slightly mocked by people. I was the only one in a dinner jacket. So I became a form of spectator sport in a sense, right? Which meant I got drinks bought for me at half time, at the interval. We tend to confuse rugby and opera in Wales. And at the end of the performance, I left, picked up my IBM ThinkPad. They were very expensive in those days from the cloakroom, and realized there was 10 minutes to go until the next train went north, yeah, from Grand Central. Now you can't do Lincoln Center, Grand Central Station in 10 minutes. It's not possible. So I knew that I'd then have to wait around Grand Central, which despite the architecture is not a nice place at approaching midnight. So I looked at the map. As you remember, maps are highly codified forms of information. Yeah? Maps don't require people. You can just read them. So I looked at the map and I realized I'm on the red line. Lincoln Center is on the red line. And I see that several stops north of me is a stop called 125th Street. And I remember when we came into New York on the Overground, we also stopped at 125th Street before we got to Grand Central. So I checked the map. And the map says there's a 2-block walk between the subway and the Overground. So I think, that's all right, I'll do it. I'm already north of Grand Central, I'll hop on the subway, I should just make the train. Now, 125th Street is now a really safe area of New York, but this was a long time ago. If I told this story 10 years ago, New Yorkers look at me with an expression of horror, because then arriving at 125th Street at 11 o'clock at night in a dinner jacket with a white skin, carrying a very expensive IBM computer on your shoulder, was, as I realized pretty fast, a very stupid thing to have done. So I'm walking down a street knowing that if I run, it will happen quickly. If I walk, it will happen anyway. I'm being surrounded by people. Yeah? When a police car drew up, I was never more grateful to see NYPD than this, and said, "Buddy, what the hell are you doing here?" All right? And he said the only reason I'd lived is nobody could believe anybody could be that stupid, and it had bought me 10 minutes breathing space. Yeah? Either way, I told this story the next day, and I was still shaking a bit at Armonk, all right? And they said, "Didn't you just know you shouldn't do that?" And I said, "No, the map doesn't say here be muggers and other strange beasts. Yeah, the map says if I get off here and walk across there, I can catch a train." And they said, "But everybody knows that." And that's the problem. Yeah, you have to make so many assumptions in creating information that actually you can often get things badly wrong. So that's map use. Contrast that with using a taxi. So London taxi drivers have something called a knowledge. They drive around the streets of London on a motor scooter for 2.5 years in their own time at their own cost, with a map of London strapped to the handlebars until they know the name of every street and every turn. And the exam is to be given any 2 points in London, describe the route out, the route back, turn by turn, and if you don't get it right, you fail. Yeah? The London taxi drivers have a physically rechanged brain as a result of this process. It takes about 2 years. Now that's actually quite interesting, by the way. In Australia, they don't let kids drive cars with passengers until they've got 2 years' experience. Because it takes 2 years for the body and the brain to co-evolve to the point where you can drive instinctively without paying attention. So there's lots of stuff we learned from this. Either way, a taxi driver can get you somewhere very, very quickly if you trust them, but it costs a lot of money to create taxi drivers. So one of the questions I came up with is it a problem for a taxi driver or is it a problem for a map? Taxi drivers, reliable but very expensive. Maps, not very expensive, but you've got to be careful what you do because there are so many assumptions. And all of that follows from that rule. The fourth rule is about how people volunteer knowledge. In the context of real need, nobody will refuse to share knowledge with you. Yeah? Now, if you ask somebody what they know, or you ask people for information and they can't see why you want it, that's different. So if somebody comes to me and say, can you help me with this, or what do you know about this? Most people will respond. If somebody says, will you write this down and put it on a database so somebody else can use it sometime when you're not around, very few people will do that. Yeah? So if you've got people refusing to share knowledge, it's generally because you've got the affordance wrong, you've got the context wrong, you're not set in the right sort of environment. Fifth, failure is more important for learning than success. We actually retain failure faster than we retain success in cognitive terms. We tell stories of failure to our children through fairy stories. We don't tell stories about success, or at least very rarely. The stories everybody wants to hear are stories of failure. We did a big project on safety. The story everybody knew was the story of the guy who failed to clip on his safety harness, fell off a gantry, and one of his colleagues broke his fall, so he lived, but the colleague broke his leg. Everybody told that story. Nobody told the stories about how they clipped on and were safe. Yeah, negative stories provide much more effective learning mechanisms than anything else. The sixth rule is the way we know things is not the way we say we know them. This is actually quite scary. I did work in the North Sea once on field ethnography, where we landed on the rig in the middle of a storm was brewing. It was a troubleshooter. And I wasn't enjoying myself much because this guy didn't like me very much. He had me following him around. And this was the first time I'd ever been in a helicopter, and I thought it was a nice journey when we set off for Aberdeen because it was bright and sunny. But that translated into a bit of a nightmare in the North Sea. And I could see the yellow circle of the helicopter landing pad beneath me. But every now and then it disappeared as a set of waves crashed over it. So either way, I turned to the helicopter pilot and said, you can't land there, can you? And he said, no, and I relaxed. And then he said, I'm going to hover over it and you're going to jump, which is what I then had to do, right? Either way, I turned round to the guy I was shadowing and he looked at me, and he's looking at me with this expression of contempt because I'm on all fours, all right? I'm not enjoying myself, all right? This is scary, all right? It's noisy, yeah? As the helicopter taking off, the waves are crashing, you've got the noise of the rig. And I turned to him and I said, how are you going to know what's going on here? And he said, I already know, can't you hear it? It's in the music of the rig. Yeah? And by asking him how he knew in the context of his knowing, I got a dozen heuristics or rules of thumb. When I interviewed him back in the ranch, or rather back in the office he was a Texan, so the idea has come, back in the office in Aberdeen, basically he gave me a structured, logical, ordered process which bore no relationship whatsoever to how he actually made decisions in the field. It's why when we map knowledge, we go directly to the knowledge act, and we don't have reflective capture through interviews or focus groups. And the seventh, and probably one of the more important, is a thing in cognitive science called conceptual blending. The way we make a decision is not a structured, ordered process. We get multiple memories triggered, both our own and ones we've heard through stories, and we blend them together with the current experience to come up with a course of action. We don't follow a structured, logical, ordered guideline. Human beings blend half-remembered patterns, and in evolutionary terms that has massive advantage because it means we're more likely to innovate or to adapt very quickly. Yeah? So those are 7 basic rules or principles of how we know things. Yeah? I could add more to them, I have added more to them, but they're a good basic summary. And managing anything, leading anything, understanding anything, you need to understand knowledge. It's still a foundation discipline.